Alright, Doctor Who time again, and I'm picking up from where I left off talking about villains. Last time I did one-time appearances. This time I'm going to tackle recurring villains. Again, restricting myself to the current version of the show. I'm not dealing with classic Doctor Who right now. And to be clear in terms of definitions, a recurring villain has to have appeared in more than one story, two-parters only count as one story, and they have to have been the villain clearly in at least two of those appearances. They do not have to have been the central villain for both appearances, but they have to have been very clearly intended as villains in two appearances, at least. So using those as the ground rules, that gives us 11 recurring villains in the Doctor Who current era. Let's get going. Number 11, the Slitheen. I make no bones about the fact that I have a lot of problems with the Slitheen. They're juvenile, I don't particularly care for that weird baby face design, but there are some ways in which they're really used effectively. When they're being played by the humans as opposed to the big CGI or puppeted things, they work quite well and they're intimidating and they have a sense of menace to them. And it works especially well when we get the second appearance with Boomtown and just dealing with only one of them who's now the last of her family, and it's almost a little bit of a Hannibal Lecter, Clarice Starling vibe when it's her talking with the Doctor. Now, which one you want to consider to be Hannibal, which one Clarice, I'll leave that up to you, but it's that kind of back and forth play, and that second one did make up some ground. Number 10, Cassandra. There's some really cool things about Cassandra as a villain. Just the kind of the play on plastic surgery and how far she is from being anything even vaguely resembling human anymore, yet still considers herself to be the last pure human alive. Just the irony of that alone is wonderful. And then her arrogance around that label that she's given herself, last human alive, and she's just so high on herself. It's a great send-up of just that sort of high society. It's a very British kind of send-up in that way, but you know, Doctor Who is inherently British at many times, so it works wonderfully. She doesn't rank higher on the list because for me she is a little bit one note, and also I felt her second appearance was rather forced, all things considered. Although that said, I think the little coda that they had for her, kind of giving her a moment of humanity, was a nice way to wrap up her story. Number 9, the Nestene. The Nestene, I really feel like we're still waiting for a really great story to really focus on these guys. That said, when they get used pretty well. They serve their function for sort of that initial intro to the Doctor for the new times. And when they popped up again as part of the Pandorica, that was a really clever use of the duplicates. And that sort of payoff with Rory ending up being one of them and the eventual redemption for him was also really nicely played. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the way the Nestene have been done so far. I do feel like there's a lot of untapped potential in what could be done with them, and they just need the right story and the right writer to really tap that potential. Number 8, Madame Kovarian. In some ways, she's a little bit cartoonish. Between the eye patch and just how sort of arch she is, it's a little bit of a caricature, but it's effective nonetheless because she starts out with that mysterious thing. She's just showing up, but we don't know what's going on, and just the vitriol we get out of her when she's confronting the Doctor head on, and just this hatred that we don't even know where it's really coming from, but there's no question that it's there. She sells that really well, despite being a little bit one note at times. She's just used really effectively, and the way that she gets closed out, courtesy of Amy Pond, that was really satisfying. And you've got to give credit for that, because the elimination of a villain isn't satisfying if the villain didn't work on some level. So I got to give her that. Number 7, the Sontarans. Now we're starting to get into some really good stuff. And their two-parter was a really good return for them. And it really sold what sort of makes them menacing, this war mentality and the fact that they really crave battle. And that militaristic mind. It all just fits together. Plus a really good redesign that kept the heart of that original design from the classic era, but updated it just enough. The Sontarans probably would have ranked higher. Honestly, they have been played for jokes more recently, and I think we can blame Strax for that. Now, I love Strax as a character, but because he's become so comical, a lot of the late appearances of Sontarans have also been played for comedy. And I think they kind of need to another episode where they are the full-on antagonist, and so we can bump them up to where they really should be in the first place. Number 6, the Cybermen. Now, when the Cybermen are used well, they're used extremely well. However, they're not always used well in the new series. While on balance I have mixed feelings about sort of the alternate world Cybermen that we have gotten for pretty much all of the new series, I can't deny that they are effective. And things like the sounds of those boots tromping, the tone of their voice, and just the overall design. Again, it's just enough of that classic design, but it's been updated. I like them when they're used in smaller pieces. I love the appearance of the partial Cyberman in the Pandorica story. I loved Closing Time. And I think those sort of smaller, quieter uses of the Cybermen as this sort of insidious thing that it only takes one and they get at you, you're in a whole lot of trouble. When they make them bigger, like Nightmare and Silver, it didn't work for me. So when they go large scale, I feel they don't hold up as well. You keep the story smaller with them and they can be really scary. Number 5, The Master. Now, in all honesty, I am not a huge fan of John Simm's first appearance as the Master. I think he went just a little too, almost kind of wacky with it. I'm not a huge fan of that portrayal. The character is still used very well, especially in terms of his impact on the Doctor. That's all played very well. The character himself wasn't bad, but I didn't really sell it for me. However, when he returned for David Tennant's last story, I thought he was fantastic. That version of the Master, who is just completely gone, any pretense of sanity is gone, and not only is he the same homicidal maniac he's always been, he's now just completely unhinged. He's barely got a grasp on reality. And that time, with his performance, John Sims really sold that because he'd have these little moments of clarity, but then he'd just start to lose it again. And that balance was really effective and also really scary. There's something really frightening about somebody who, when he's collected, would have no problem obliterating you. But then they're even more dangerous when they're unhinged, and seeing both sides of that, and that he's not really in control of himself anymore. Number 4. The Great Intelligence. Now, this is one that I've actually liked in every appearance, but I really started to appreciate it when I started putting this list together, just how well this character was used. Initial appearance was a little bit off-putting. The whole episode of The Snowmen was a little bit up and down in a lot of ways, but having it voiced by Ian McKellen, first of all, was a really masterstroke, and then having him come back using the face of Dr. Simeon, which gave Richard E. Grant much more to do than he did when he appeared in The Snowman, and really to bank on his inherent gravitas that he has as an actor, works wonderfully. Even if it was just that little appearance at the end of The Bells of St. John, that just immediately hooked me into him as a character again, and then seeing what he went through just to torture the Doctor, because usually these villains have much bigger plans. Revenge is actually very rarely a motivation for a villain in Doctor Who. So to have somebody this bent on just taking out the Doctor and destroying him as completely as is possible, even at the expense of his own life, that's something we don't really see for the most part. There's plenty of characters with grudges against the Doctor, but if they get to take out a grudge on him, that's a side thing to some other world-dominating scheme they've got. Not the case with this guy. Not in his last appearance, anyway. He's after the Doctor, he's going for the Doctor, and he takes him out. He wins, really. It gets undone by Clara, but that's some pretty frightening stuff what he puts the Doctor through. Number 3, The Weeping Angels. Now, I will be completely honest. I was really skeptical the first time we found out that the Weeping Angels were going to come back for another story. They were so effective in Blink, I thought there's no way this is going to work a second time around. Well, I was proved wrong, and they've worked pretty much every time they've come back, at least when they've been the central part of the story. Blink is pretty much flawless. Time of the Angels, Stone and Flesh, that is a great two-parter, and it really builds up that, a couple of these things are scary. A ton of them, they could do some serious damage, and that was really well done, and it gave us some new aspects of them to keep it fresh. Angels in Manhattan pushed the believability of them a little bit, but the notion of what they were doing was scary enough, and the emotional impact of what happened late in that episode was powerful enough that it still worked. They did just get tossed into a couple things later on with things like Time of the Doctor, where they were just sort of there because, well, it's Matt Smith's last episode. We gotta have them. Well, no, you shouldn't have. I thought that kind of cheapened them a little bit, but they're still amazingly effective villains. Number 2, The Silence. Now, I know that people who prefer the Weeping Angels are going to point out that the gimmick for the Silence is almost identical to the Weeping Angels. The reasons are different, but in both cases, you can't look away from them or you're dead. Now, I appreciate that, but the mechanics of the Silence, and the reason you can't look away from them, unnerves me a lot more than the Weeping Angels. Because the Weeping Angels, if you know what they are, you know that if you're looking at them, you are still safe. The Silence, first of all, looking at them does not make you any safer, because they can still kill you no matter what. But the instant you turn away, that you just even forget you're in danger, and just messing with your head like that, that sort of pushes my buttons in terms of what unnerves me a little bit more than living statues. Now, the Weeping Angels work very well in terms of that hiding in plain sight, but the idea that a Silence could literally walk down the street and nobody would remember seeing it, that just really creeps me out. And I love the design. It is evocative of sort of that classic sort of general alien design, but then paired with the suit and just the lack of a mouth and the physicality of the performers that they use, all just adds up to an insanely effective villain that I think has been used extremely well pretty much every single time they've turned up. What's at number 1? Was there ever any doubt? Really? The Daleks. Now, have the Daleks had a perfect string of hits with every single appearance? Well, no, but the only big misfire that they had was Daleks and Manhattan Evolution of the Daleks two-parter. And the thing is, though, the ideas behind that one are really solid. The execution is a complete mess, but that is not the fault of these characters as villains. I think they are amazing now just as much as they were in the classic era. They were introduced perfectly with Dalek, and then you just sold you the idea of one of these things is terrifying, and then you had to deal with armies of them. You had to deal with the Emperor Dalek or the Supreme Dalek. I am actually a really big sucker for the new Paradigm Daleks. I do feel like we didn't get the mileage out of those we should have, because it feels like the show kind of pulled back from that idea when most fans didn't react so well to it. I really like them, and I kind of wish we had done more of that. If nothing else, I want to know what the heck an Eternal is, because you remember that? They all set, all the different colors said what their jobs was, and it was things like Supreme, Scientist, Soldier. One of them said Eternal. What is an Eternal Dalek? I want to know. Or another appearance I love, Asylum of the Daleks. Seeing Daleks fully functional, that's scary, but seeing crazed Daleks that not even they can control, it's a little bit like what I said before with the Master being unhinged. Something that can tear you apart when it's collected, that's scary. That same thing now completely bonkers, that's terrifying. I do think that they sort of reversed the Daleks forgetting who the Doctor was a little sooner. I think they should have strung that out at least for another full season before they found out who he was again. But again, that's not a fault for these villains, and they are used really, really well. Whether it is a single Dalek appearing briefly or whether it is a horde of them coming at you, somehow they've really managed to keep them up, even though, you know, they get defeated repeatedly. They should be a joke by now. Heck, just look at the design. It's a rolling trash can with a plunger. How can that work? They make it work. It's been working since the early days. It still works now. Daleks, number 1. You knew it was going to be the case. So that's my ranking for recurring, current age Doctor Who villains. What about you? What's your number 1? Is it the Daleks? Is it something else? Drop it down in the comments. Let's talk about it. But until next time, this council is adjourned.